find something to write down every time I don't find something, I put on my bag and I like just in case something occurred to me.
All right. Fine. Well, good evening to you and welcome to another program of Rodney Groundings. I'm your host, Dion Abrams, and on this evening's program I have with me Professor Clive Thomas and Brother Desmond Trotman, and we'll be talking about issues current in the political, economic, and social sphere here in Guyana. Welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dion,
Dion.
and good evening, viewers.
Well, we've been quite busy over the past few weeks. We've had to replay some programs, but
By special request.
by special request, it's a pleasure to be back here with you. I myself would have lost an aunt, um, and I had to be busy with the preparation for the funeral and so on. But the budget is in the air, and with that, we've had a number of pronouncements. Can we say, first of all, that this is a budget for the people, taking into consideration its size and all of these things?
But you want me to
Yeah,
start?
yeah,
I think I've been making the point here very often, Dion, and I'd like to start with that. A government can't spend money unless it raises it by taxation or it borrows it. Money doesn't come out of thin air for the government to spend. It doesn't fall like manna from heaven. A government has to get it from its citizens, or it has to get into debt in order to be able to spend. So when you look at a large budget like they claim this one is, the largest ever, $208 billion, you have to recognize that the bulk of that, maybe over 90% of that, is being financed
By the people.
by the taxation of persons, and the rest is being financed by the incurring of debt, and that debt will have to be eventually repaid, because you don't get into debt and don't repay the debt. So ultimately, the citizens of Guyana will have to pay for that budget. The thing that concerns me when you boast about a large budget is that a government can be effective, and when there's a large budget, can be doubly effective because it's working economically efficient. But in the case of Guyana, we have a dysfunctional government, a government incapable of delivering the goods in a cheap and efficient manner, a government that can't provide for the systematic execution of projects. We see the roads that fall apart before the rainy season. We see the culverts that don't last any time. We see the government buildings that are overbloated, dilapidated in a few weeks' time. We see all the evidences, even in the very big projects, like the Mailer Falls thing, the hydro site that we're talking about, which promises to spend nearly $1 billion United States dollars. We see it in the Hope Canal project. We see it in the Skeldon project, which was spent over 250 million US dollars. That the government is inefficient in the spending. So when the size of the budget goes up and the government is inefficient, the burden falls on us, the taxpayers, to foot that inefficiency. Because the truth of the matter is that if you borrow money, or if you spend on a project to make more money in the future, then that future money can pay back for the project. But if the project is being done in an inefficient manner, if the project sometimes don't worth the salt or the paper they're written on, then you have a case where resources that rightfully belong to the taxpayers are being wasted. And it's in that fundamental sense I want viewers to understand the nature of government and this budgeting, because that gives them a fundamental right to exercise an opinion about the budget. I would say more than a right to exercise an opinion. I would say almost an obligation to take part in the discussion about the budget, because if the budget spends your income, it doesn't spend manna from heaven. It doesn't like Houdini find true magic resources for the government to spend. The government has to earn those resources or steal those resources from us, take it from us before it can spend it. So we have a right and a duty to be involved in the discussion about where the budget is taking us. And this talk about 208 billion be the largest ever. We hear that repeated every year. Every year they say this one is larger than the one from before. And that always goes up. But I'm saying what is going up is the increasing inefficiency of the government as reflected in the size of the budget. And therefore the increasing burden on taxpayers and the real sense in that they have to repay of finances spending that the government is undertaking.
Brother Trotman, you're in Parliament. What is the view, particularly of the APNU in relation to the budget as a budget for the people?
Well, Dion, our position in relation to the budget is very clear because we have looked at the way in which the budget deals with the questions of the issues of the vulnerable in society and the impact that the budget will have on them. And we're very concerned that that really hasn't been addressed to the satisfaction of the people. While it is true that there has been an increase in the old age pensions, there's also been an increase in the cost of living. And so that the increase in the old age pension is wiped out almost immediately. We have to be very concerned about these kinds of developments. And we have been saying to the government that if it is that you review what it you've done in relation to the budget, in relation to non-benefits for the most vulnerable, that you've done a bad job. In fact, the points that has been raised by Professor are points which we've been arguing throughout our presentations. The position of the government is one of arrogance in relation to their responses to these positions that we've been adopting. But we continue to press the case because we are very, very concerned about what is happening and where the society is going as a result of, and where the society will go as a result of this budget, which has been deemed the largest ever.
Yeah, I think that that is a very good position for the APNU to take, because one point which comes out when you recognize that the government can't spend money that it doesn't get from the taxpayers or it borrows, is that when the government spends, it affects the distribution of income and wealth in the country. Some of cronies get the projects, some groups and others in the society tend to benefit more than others, and they will sing the praises of the budget. Like, for example, the private sector, I understand, is very happy about the budget because it offers them some goodies, but the ordinary person in the street is not happy about it because it does not seem to be a budget with an option for the poor. Instead, it's a budget that shows an option for the nouveau riche, the new rising criminal classes and others associated with all this newfound wealth coming out of corruption, coming out of narco dealing and so on, illegal activities in Guyana. Because look at some of the activities of the budget, some of the actions that it plans. It plans to reduce the income taxation by, I think, 3.25%. Who's going to benefit most from that? Those who earn the higher incomes. It is true everybody will benefit by 3.25%, but those who earn
less than
much more than several million a month, and those who earn a couple of thousand a month, are in two entirely different positions. The budget also raises the allowance for property taxes. That is, before it was $1.5 million, and after that, I think you started to pay property taxes, if my memory serves me right. But the budget makes that now $30 billion.
40.
40 million. It just goes to show you what it means in terms of the bias of the budget. Because they didn't think of bringing down the VAT. They think of alleviating the burden to the property classes. And I think that has developed because there's been a lot of criticisms, a lot of calls for a Taj Mahal tax on the ostentatious properties that those who are benefiting from the PPC government are putting up around the country. And people are saying this is a sign of wealth, and if you can't capture the wealth in any other way, you can place a tax on the abode, and the people will pay the tax. Now, this has been done in some countries, that's why it's called a Taj Mahal tax, because it is believed that it's a tax where people like to show off their wealth. And to them, putting a tax in it is not going to reduce their need for the property, because the thing that is driving them is the need for ostentatious display. It is what is called a positional tax. You want to show your position in the country, how well off you are, how much you can live the lifestyle of persons that cannot even dream of that within the country. And therefore, they're not likely to depress the demand for that type of housing when you put a tax. If anything, they feel more encouraged to get into that type of housing, because they have to be very wealthy to afford to pay the tax and to buy the property. So that is what they're trying to do, and it shows an option, I think, for this new rising class that is associated with the criminalization of the state, this rising petty bourgeois class that is showing some of the benefits, reaping some of the benefits that comes from the legal circulation of the proceeds of plunder, theft, trade in illegal goods and services within the country.
John, if we go back to the point, the earlier point which Professor made, and that is the allowance in relation to the reduction in the personal income tax. I like to deal with these things in money terms, because I think people better understand it when it is that you could place it with a dollar rather than percentage. And you know, Professor's right that there's a very, very large group of persons who do not earn $50,000 per month, and who will not be earning $50,000 per month for the longest while. And so that group of persons will not benefit from the reduction in the personal income tax. But even for those persons who will benefit, which really comprise a larger grouping, the very few persons who I'm concerned about, who fall into the over $50,000 bracket, because that's not an extremely large number. I'm talking about persons who are more of the working class than anything else. Those persons stand to benefit by a reduction of 3 1/3 cents in every dollar that they're required to pay, which is, if you really think about it, is ridiculous. So while it is that they're flaunting this thing about this tremendous reduction in the personal income tax bracket, that in actual fact, very few persons who will benefit meaningfully, except those persons who are very, very large income earners and who really are the people who will get and so that we got to be concerned about the fat cats, those fat salaried persons, and they are the persons who are going to be benefiting tremendously. But those persons who earn less than $50,000 and who barely earn $50,000, over $50,000, are not will not enjoy any real benefits from this so-called reduction.
Now, in relation to the taxes, apart from the 33 1/3, which would have been reduced to 30, there is the continued argument on the 16% VAT. And I noticed Greenwich arguing that, you know, the VAT is raking in a lot of revenue, and that they would not have directed this revenue in favor of the poor.
Yeah.
All right, and the reduction in VAT, Ashley Singh is arguing that it will benefit the rich.
Yeah, you already went into that argument. Most ridiculous set of Jumbie. I call it Jumbie.
He continues to argue with that position.
Ridiculous.
Okay. Would you go back, reflect again on this whole idea of reduction in VAT benefiting rich people in the context of the budget?
The idea of a VAT tax, to be clear, is to try to capture that income which you cannot capture. You might not be easily able to capture through income or wealth taxation. So the person who gets legal proceeds, you might not be able to trace it from the source that they got it. So you can't tax it as income from source. But you can tax it when it's spent, because it circulates through the system. So you might be able to capture some of that income with the VAT tax. That's the idea that initially tended to propel this type of thing into favor. But in the process of doing that, the persons who are also very poor and who have to buy things are affected by the tax. And there's no doubt whatsoever that a tax that is based on consumption affects the poor more
No.
than a tax that is based on income. If it's based on income, they would have a less income and therefore a better chance of avoiding the penalties of the tax. But if it's based on consumption, they have to pay it just like the rich man or the person who's earning $100 million and who will see out of their reduction in income tax at $3.3 million coming to him.
Everything.
But the man who's earning $10,000 don't see nothing much coming out of it.
But does this highlight a weakness in our system? Because in the United States and so on, they have the IRS, they have agencies that investigate people's earnings and so on.
Yeah, but they also have a sales tax in the States. So this is not something new.
No, it's
But the point is sales tax is much lower. The thing about a sales tax, the VAT is like a sales tax, but it's much lower, 6 and 8%. And that's the point people are making, that you don't have to have it as high as it is in Guyana, because that is too burdensome. But the government is, of course, raking in money.
yeah.
It's the largest single source of revenue, if you look at the budget. So the government don't want to trouble that. It before if it gives an ease to use that source of revenue, even though it's punishing poor people to get it, to give back benefits to those who own property, but not to alleviate those who are poor and are relying on spending for goods and services and have to buy these things. They claim that some of the things are zero rated, but all the evidence shows that the majority of things that people buy, the overwhelming majority, are not zero rated, and they have to pay for these things.
But I'm considering the attempt to capture those who are not in maybe a government job or so on, the private persons, the business people who are earning income but may not be paying taxes. All
No,
right?
but they can. You should be able to capture them through the GRA. The companies should be making returns, and all the people to whom they pay income and collecting the tax at source. The PAYE system we have, pay as you earn.
But they always argue about lawyers and doctors and
Well, it's self-employed. That's where the difficulty comes. But you said companies.
okay.
The self-employed pay a disproportionately small share of taxes to the government. I think out of $120 billion of revenue, they pay less than 1%. And yet we know that the bulk, as a significant portion of income earned in this country is by the self-employed. And it is much more than 1%. Probably quoting something like up to maybe 12-15%. So it can be 15 or more times more than that which is being captured right now.
So how do is this VAT a part of this scheme to also
But
deal
I
with
think
that?
the VAT would capture them when they spend, yes. But it's not a scheme to deal with that. One of the problems with our taxation is that the tax rates are generally too high because the government is too bloated and too big. It wants to spend too much. If the rates were down, if they were low, if they were like, so remember some Caribbean countries don't even have an income tax. If it were down to 20, 25%, 15%, people would be willing to declare it and pay it and then move on. So that reduction of the tax rate is expected to increase the tax yield, not to reduce it. The government doesn't recognize that, so they feel that they have to go out and be onerous. So it drives everybody except those who are captured by the state into some sort of illegality by not declaring the income to the state, to the GRA.
So in the face of
But
all
the government
this,
has said, in the face of all this, there's only one way to go, and that is tax reform. The government had announced the first major decision announced by the president after the elections was that he would set up a tax reform committee. And we talked about that here.
Certainly.
Because that gave hope that there would be some rationalization of the tax structure. We'd get a new social contract about taxation, so people would pay their taxes because they find the new system to be fair and just and equitable to all. And they will buy into it and be part of their property, because we expected the Commission of Inquiry not to be an ordinary tax committee, but like a commission of inquiry, getting evidence up and down the country and trying to develop a consensus in favor of the type of taxes we'd have. But that has not happened. And as a result, we continue to have the same dysfunctional system we've been complaining about for the past 2 decades.
As far as I understand, that committee has never met.
No, well,
That's what I understand too.
And so that it's an exercise in futility.
An exercise in deception.
In
because
deception, yeah.
one of the things you have to recognize about this government is that when you look carefully at its actions and activities in the budget, you see a systematic effort to perpetrate deception. I mean, this thing is not unintended. This government is very subtle. Look at the Linden inquiry. Everybody thought we had agreements, but look at the systematic way in which those agreements have been nullified. Everybody thought that we had a tax committee going to be working. Look at the systematic way in which all the talk about tax reform has been nullified. We have plans for the sugar industry. These plans are never published. They're supposed to be secret documents. Yet they're public plans about a public company. A company belonging to the people of Ghana. I can't see it, I haven't seen them yet. And if I get access to them, I'd have to get it illegally. And not illegally, illicitly, because there's no law preventing me from getting it. And in that sense, therefore, they don't publish what the plans are. And therefore, they don't report on the plans. It's only when you begin to quarrel and complain about how the sugar industry is performing that they begin to say, well, look, now we can have a new plan starting from 2013 to 2018. That's how we know that the old plan is therefore being abandoned. Because they can't come up with any response to the fact that the sugar industry is getting more and more subsidies as it's producing less and less at a higher and higher cost. How can this contradiction exist? What would make sense in a company or a government wanting to do that? So they say they have a new plan to turn it around. But you don't publish the old plan. You don't publish the performance on the old plan. So nobody has an idea of the results of the old plan and how that functioned. This thing runs through the entire system. Look at education. You're a teacher. How many education plans have been? There's been no evaluation of the education plans. No analysis of the outcomes, so we could say that we learned this lesson from the past plan or that lesson from the plan before, and therefore we can try to address these issues in the new plan. We have health plans. We have all these sector plans. We have one for the forest now, and you don't get any report on what has been happening. So this act of systematic suppression of information from the public, treating it as a private property of the cabinet or the government, is something we got to fight against. Remember, I had made a remark, one of the most backward statements I've ever heard expressed in the 21st century was when the then president of this country, had said that he does not want to give the data to the IMF because when he publishes the data, when they give the IMF and they publish it, the opposition and critics of the country use it to criticize him. Could you imagine anything more backward? This is a government that talking the traditional Freddie Jagan, who used to say that the IMF and the World Bank don't pursue our national interests, and they're the ones we got to guard against. But yet he's willing to give them the information and not give it to his own people because he's fearful that his own people use it as criticism. And this is a sign of small, not only small-mindedness, but the intellectual inferiority. They don't have confidence in what they're doing. So every criticism is seen as an act of condemnation to them. It is not seen as a source of engagement for improvement. It is seen as a source of condemnation and attack. So they attack the messenger and they forget about the message. And that's a systematic trait that we find existing in this country. And these things come up every time in the budget. The biggest deception, of course, the GDP figures, the debt figures and all that. I've written for months now that, for years, that we get into a situation where the debt is overrunning, getting too large, the debt to GDP ratio. What the government does this year Nowhere in the budget can you find the
And
domestic debt at the end of December 31, 2012, for the first time of the previous year. So they're trying to hide that figure now. It will come out after the budget debate is finished. By which time to forget, they hope people have forgotten about it, even though some of us are writing and we have an idea what the figure should be. But what is even worse than that is that people are beginning to realize that the figures they give for the domestic debt are not accurate, because the government's debt is not just what they print in the papers. It is also all the contingent liabilities they have to cover in the event of things going wrong. Like, for example, the NS debt might be debt owed to the NIS, but something goes wrong with the scheme. The government has to step in. From its previous track record, we can see that it will be forced to step in, like with CLICO and so on. If the banks in this country were to get into financial problems, the government can't just sit back and say, let the market take its course. They'll be forced to intervene. So all those so-called private liabilities of the bank will become de facto public liabilities, as happened in Ireland, as is happening in Cyprus, as happening in Greece, as happening in Spain. So the government will find itself now overwhelmed with the domestic debt that it claims it never had. So you have to begin to present the figures to the public, and the opposition has to begin to demand that in a way that allows for an intelligent appraisal of how this government is behaving in terms of the handling of its growing indebtedness. And the simple fact is that some of the statistics are stark. Between 2007 and now, the external debt which they publish on, because they can't avoid it with the IMF, has doubled from $0.7 billion to $1.4 billion. It has doubled. It's the highest level it's ever been in the 2000s. And yet, the Mamagai, the opposition, let them get away with it. Somebody asked a question, the minister said, the external debt is 48%, nobody can check it. And
But
then we browbeat them, and that's the end of the matter.
what I saw Maxwell stating in the newspaper is that they continually refer to the PNC's debt. But the
Well,
PNC's debt was not even to the magnitude
No,
of
but
theirs.
to be fair, when the PNC was running this country, the debt rose as high as 700%.
Well, his
of GDP.
position was that
Yeah, but he's twisting the figures just like them. The basic idea is to be truthful, to be frank. We don't want to get back to the PNC position. That's what we try to do. So when I write to warn people about the debt, is to avoid going back into the pitfalls that we fell into in the 1970s and 1980s. It is not to rewrite history and to pretend we didn't have all these difficult times to go through, because those were the worst times, some of the worst times that we ever had in Guyana. And so what I want them to do is to focus on the incipient emergence of a growing indebtedness, a lack of macroeconomic stability in this country. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the Third World Debt Crisis, and I wrote a paper on it highlighting Guyana's role in that debt crisis. And why I did so is partly because Guyana was like Mexico. The crisis was supposed to have started in 1982 when Mexico defaulted. But many people didn't know that in that same year, because Guyana is not as important as Mexico, Guyana also defaulted. So that crisis that we had for the Third World can be traced not only from Mexico but through Guyana until today. So the emergence of this problem is something that I want people to pay attention to, and I want the public to be alert to. But the government is intent on suppressing this information. That is why they're hiding the domestic debt figures. That is why they don't talk about contingent liabilities. And therefore, what we need to do as a responsible opposition is a forceful recognition of this, so that something is done to address it. Because we don't want to sink back into the pits of despair that we had back in the 1970s and the 1980s, when we couldn't even get foreign exchange to buy cheese and biscuits and flour and all that.
Yeah, but one of the things too, the fact is that the debt that would be incurred, particularly the external debt, we are saying that the we're no longer IPIC, which means that we
Well,
will be.
still have liabilities on the HIPIC.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but the ability to have those major write-offs would have been significantly reduced.
Yeah, yeah.
So it means that the burden obviously would fall on the people of the country.
Yeah, of course.
So
Because you see, that's where the government's deception puts them in trouble. They're anxious to prove that they're not poor by manipulating the figures. And the process of doing that, they're manipulating themselves out of the opportunities to get fair and accommodating treatment that are really due to the country and the type of circumstance we are in. It's not as if we're pretending to be poor. We are in a circumstance of a poor country, and we should not hide from it to say that the international community don't have an obligation to play a part to ensure that it doesn't spread or doesn't provide some contagion to the rest of the Caribbean and the rest of the world. They have an obligation. Because when they have their crises, we have to chip in to try to help to prevent it from spreading. So we should look at that as a mutual obligation that states have with each other. And we shouldn't be looking at something we got to maneuver, so we look to our population as if we're doing the best macroeconomic management the world has ever seen, as I think the head of the presidential secretary has said. And we have no problem, just like we said, the NIS is in perfect health.
and Clayco was in perfect health.
Yeah, everything in perfect health.
Everybody.
Must have spin. But Dion, I would like us to look a little more on what this the field of the government to provide workers with increased salaries and wages and salaries, what it really means for them. Because as Professor Thomas has pointed out, the Private Sector Commission has gotten some sweeteners, and they're excited about the budget. And they seem not to be like the government sparing any thought for the plight of the most vulnerable categories. And I would like, because people, I mean, this program has a wide clientele, you know, and people look to this program every week for pointers on where it is, what is they're faced with, and where they should be going.
Yeah,
and as a result, I think it's
continue.
extremely important that we should speak to that issue and, you know, let them know something. I am concerned that in a situation where a government talks about the highest largest ever budget in the country, that not a single cent has been set aside for wage earners. Not a single cent. And we have to really be concerned about this, because what an immediate increase in the wages and salaries of workers do is to allow them the opportunity to even minimally address the whole question of the rising cost of living, the rising prices, goods and services. And then it is year after year, workers are treated with disdain as in the way in which the government treats workers, that we have to be concerned. Remember, Professor Thomas spoke on this program about what it really means to be given an increase at the end of the year, this 5% increase which government imposes at the end of the year. And he pointed out the jeopardies that are involved in that situation vis-a-vis the granting, at a particular point in time. And so, Professor, the situation that we are faced with at this particular juncture, I think is important that you, for us, at least from my own knowledge, and of course for the larger audience who are out there listening to this program, watching at it, to really speak about the implications of not being given an increase at this particular time.
I think you made a couple of points that are important. One of them is, as you said, the public sector, like the government, certain parts of this budget is appealing. But the private sector is in many ways like the government. They have the same class interests, the same modus operandi as the government. This private sector that, as represented by the Private Sector Commission, that manipulates the NIS and don't pay the people, the employees, pay over the benefits to the NIS. It's the same private sector that avoids tax and evades taxes. You can practice avoidance of taxes so insofar as that is legal, but you can't evade it. So the same private sector has a lot of things not going for it in terms of their endearment to the interests of the wider Guyanese working class. The private sector is also not a democratic institution, the PSC. The bulk, the mass of employees are in small businesses, small little shops and little operations around the country, which cannot possibly get representation in that. So they don't speak to the powers that be. They are voiceless in this circumstance. And those who have the voice and the clout pursue their own interests. We saw with the case that I discussed here, with a guy who is anxious to push his containers, degradable, biodegradable containers and all that type of thing. He's anxious to do that because that he sees as part of growth and development for Guyana. But it's also part and parcel of the development of his own profits and incomes of his company. So you have that sort of synergy. It's the same private sector that's been superintended by the Financial Intelligence Unit, which reports that it's unable to do anything effective, done nothing ever to be able to control or to even bring to trial any significant elements of that private sector for irregularities or crimes undertaken in terms of under the present financial regulations. It is that same private sector that I think that sits at the vortex between the state and its criminalization, because the people move frequently between the two. The person engaged in illegal trade, illegal drugs, illegal smuggling is celebrated in the country as a businessman. The papers report on that person as a business person. They don't call them anything else. They don't dare. So they call them business persons. So the whole notion of what a business person is a depraved version of what a true entrepreneur or business person should be idolizing them in the country represents. So I don't give up any respect whatsoever, I might tell you, for this private sector commission as it is presently constituted. There might be elements in there that may want to do, but I don't doubt that. But I've seen the letters in the papers pointing out the conflicts of interest between the persons who hold office there and the many state regulatory agencies that are supposed to be operating against them, to the point where they made an official protest to Kaichun News for carrying this public revelation. Say the papers should never have carried information like that without double checking with them, so they could say it's not true. I presume. So I have no particular sympathy for them, and I think we have to remain as deeply suspicious of them as of the political cabal that runs the country. Neither of them have the interest of the genuine interest of the working class, the poor people, the proletariat, the unemployed at heart. They're not going to push for their interests unless it is a way to advance their own particular interests. Look at the firm that is making the biggest profits in this country. The most successful firm, you know what it is? Tobacco. That company doesn't even have a tobacco ranch. It pays no regard to the thousands of lives in Guyana that are affected by smoking and disease and death from tobacco. Its own principals don't smoke, yet they sell the tobacco. What they do, they bring in the tobacco, package it, the cigarettes put in a packet, set wholesale to some dealers in Ghana, and they make over 56% profit in that transaction. I've talked about them here before because we had to do a paper for the Ministry of Health, and I therefore reviewed the operations of the tobacco company as part and parcel of that effort. So we have these types of things happening, so we have to be very intrinsically suspicious of the tobacco industry as we are of the private sector commission, because these funds play a leading part in the operations of that commission. So that's the first point that you raised, which I think is significant and should be elaborated on the nature of the PSC. The second point which I bring to your attention is that increased wages and salaries have traditionally been treated in Ghana as payments you make to people to pacify them, as payments you give to show that you want to do good, as goodwill. But I take a very different view. I think the working class in Ghana has been so battered and beaten that the incomes, increases the incomes, represent an investment in people. It is not just an increased salary, but an investment in the opportunities for them to develop and move on to more creative and productive life. It gives them the chance of getting the children to school, the chance to get a better nutrition, to get all of these things that come with working for a living wage. So they cannot be treated as just as if it's a little bit of, here, we're doing good for you, we can give you something. It's a long-term investment in the sustenance of the working people of this country. And unless we adopt that attitude, the government will always treat what it gives to the poor in terms of wages as something whether or not it can afford. But it doesn't recognize that it cannot afford not to afford to give the working people some investment in themselves and some investment in the possibilities for the future. It is reflected in what we talked about here in the way in which the Linden Commission arrived at the valuation of a life. To them, a life was $3 million. That is not a life that is seen as a productive outcome of an investment in whatever compensation you pay for it, of the family and the other residents and other kinfolk of the persons who had been killed. Had a chance to see that life could have been something greater down the line. Could have been in my place instead of the place where they ended up, with a prospect of much more than eking out a living and bare survival. So I think that's the second fundamental defect of the situation. So from that point of view, it calls for, which is the third point I want to make, a decisive shift in the nature and conceptualization of what are the priorities of government spending. If the government spending is being financed by taxpayers' money, taxpayers also have a say in what should be the priorities. And I think they would all agree that a major priority must be the revamping, the development, the investment in the working people through jobs and opportunities for self-employment, insofar as they could make that possible. That has to be the major thrust. I don't see anything in the budget that treats that as a central thrust. I see it as more like spin, an attempt to accommodate, be giving them this year, be giving the pensioners a little extra 12,500, but they get the pensions for the public service. As I hear the Minister of Finance, the Junior Minister of Finance, said there's eternal shame, and other pensions that he might get elsewhere. Not forgetting there are many people who only get that. It's as if the world is really the world of the urban center George to where he is, and where people are working as teachers or some civil servant or some other thing, and they can draw a pension from somewhere else. And even there, even here, the people who run taxi workers, conductors, sell sweets in the street, all of these are treated as employed persons who only have that pension to rely on when they are unable to continue to work. And that is where I think we need a decisive shift in the conception of what the budget is about and what it should be directed at.
Yeah, but then you mentioned the budget. We see here them calling for an allocating $81 million for NC, and again, despite the raking of over $5 billion by the company last year, and all of these things. It shows a kind of contempt for,
Yeah, it's provocative.
Provocative.
and then you're talking about people. You're understanding that with an increased income, you're talking about raising the standard of living of people, so that when you give them a piece of land, they can actually invest in, you
Yeah.
know, a structure that they can live
and
in,
a way to make a living.
and it can even propel them to become involved in small businesses and all of these things. But apparently, they're not seeing the benefits of enhancing the ability of people to live comfortably. And you yourself, Professor, would have pointed out that during the period with the Armstrong Tribunal,
Yeah.
that the business community felt the effect
Yeah.
of the
Remember-
increases from the.
I know at that time many businessmen called me and say, you know, this is the best thing you do, see why? Because you stimulate us type of spending at the end of the year, which we didn't think would have been possible. I know that for a fact. That
So-
35% increase.
So why is it that they can't see this kind of reasoning?
They don't want
They don't want it. That's
No.
not their class interest. You see, that's why you got to go to the fundamental nature of the state.
Well,
The fundamental nature of the state is that it's being criminalized and being turned into a state for itself, where it tries to use the instruments of the state in every manner and form to promote the well-being and the property interests of the class that controls it. That is what it is. It's a state of accumulation. Look at these people, the wealth that they display. Many of these people, I knew them back in the 1990s. They had no particular earnings. They were all struggling for to make a livelihood off the streets. They fight in a political cause. Look what they end up by doing. I know it is something that stressed Jerry Jagan, and the way in which they turn out to be naked accumulators with very little social conscience. And I think we could see it even in something like the presidential benefits that legislation was passed. The way in which people don't feel ashamed about using the state as an instrument for self-advancement and promotion.
The other thing is that this continued investment in these macro projects that really do not reflect on the lives of people. Well, the Marriott Hotel, the airport.
Yeah, you see, well, their theory is that it will affect the lives of the people. They argue, for example, that the Miller Falls project is a major project to cheapen electricity and bring a form of energy together that is not polluting. And in theory, nobody can be against self-sustainable energy coming out of water. But it's a practice. To be able to do that, you have to spend nearly a thousand million, that's $1 billion, United States dollars. That's nearly 30-something% of Ghana's GDP. You can't undertake an investment of that magnitude without doing some serious investment analysis and feasibility and project appraisal studies to ensure that it can be profitable, because if not, you'll be pouring money into a sinkhole. You'll be pouring money down into a black hole. Instead of getting the benefits you expect, you'll be subsidizing those who indirectly lend you the money to get into to build the project, and who have a debt interest in what the project is the financing of the project, and who have to be repaid before the guidees can be repaid. And if the benefits over the long run do not exceed the cost of the project, so the project can be paid off, it is an inefficient decision which is costing us to do. So the point is, therefore, that we have to be sure that a project requires, I think, about 165 megawatts of electricity, costing that amount of money, is something that is feasible. And nowhere in the world is any project shown to be generating or being put into operation at costs that are so high. And that is what is even raises suspicion. So what we're calling for, or what the opposition, I hope is calling for, is that we must be privy to the feasibility studies, the project appraisals that made this project possible. But the government's tendency is to keep these things secret. And I know from the practice and experience of other people that a project study that is not subject to independent verification is a waste of paper. Because you can easily build into the project biases in the figures that will get you the results you want to have. So you need to expose these things to public scrutiny so that independent opinions can be expressed about whether the project is as viable as it appears on the surface. Because then you see all the assumptions and all the things that are made to make the project viable. The work we've done at the university with some of us, based on limited information, shows that there's no way that the project can deliver, excluding the financing of the project, which is a huge part of the cost. Can the project generate electricity at the rates I think the government has been talking about, at the cost? I think something about 18 cents or something, 21 cents per kilowatt hour. Can never do that because the size is too small and the operating costs just too high when you take into account the cost of constructing the facility and the distribution network. So that is why we want information. The thing with the Marriott Hotel is the same concerns I have. When I look at the government's medium-term strategy paper, which was published in the middle of 2011, and it indicated what it was going to do for the tourism sector. This is the middle of 2011, you know. The words Marriott Hotel appear nowhere. So you can convince me that you had a serious thought about that when suddenly in 2012 it becomes the main focus of your investment. I say no. There's some opportunistic investment that came up from some contact somebody might have had, or some fly-by-night, overnight position. You know, these people who operate governments and projects like if they're cake shops might have ordered and say, you know what, it's better we bring in Marriott. It might have something to do with the fact that they don't like the guy who owns the Pegasus as well. But it doesn't convince me of any serious and systematic thought being addressed to that project. So I have no confidence in the decision that went into the making of that project. And I feel that the government has to be told these things. You can't have a project that projects the expenditure of that massive amount of money in Marriott, and you have a statement of your medium-term plans from 2011 to 2015, and the Marriott doesn't even appear in it. You had other areas that you concentrated on as the priority areas for this push for ecotourism. So what I'm saying here is things that are based on a scientific study of the government's actions. I'm not making these things up. I write about them week after week. I'll show how it is that these things have been operating, and therefore the inventions that are needed to come to this. And that is why I've always claimed here, and I want to repeat the claim because I just want to repeat the claim. I don't say anything more. That since 2010 I've been arguing for a National Assembly Budget Office, the NABO, to be established in Guyana. And I think it's probably gaining some traction now.
And it becomes more important, Dion, when it is, if you had the opportunity to listen to the junior finance minister, Ejil, speak about how it is they propose to deal with corruption in the society, that you understand why it is important that one of the steps that they must take is to put in place the National Budget Office in order to deal with oversight of what is spending in the thing. You know, what he doesn't understand that you can't be part of the problem and be part of the solution at the same time.
Yeah.
And he is advancing,
Internal audit.
yeah, internal audits as a way forward. When it is that you look at the way in which the Ethnic Relations Commission had operated under his tenure, when you realize that the former chief executive officer was removed as a result of her willingness, as a result of her willingness to ensure that resources were dealt with in the way in which they should be dealt with, you will understand why he should not be part of this part of the solution. And he was standing up there, monkeying himself during the course of his presentation, apparently giving the impression that he could deliver some miracle in relation to bringing about a solution to this problem, not understanding that he had had the opportunity before to deliver miracles and he couldn't in 2011. And instead of proposing, and proposing the real steps that will allow for the arriving at a solution to the problem, he proposed a number of ideas which will not have currency in relation to addressing the whole question of corruption in the society.
Yeah. Well, you know,
I thought it was a particularly weak presentation.
Yeah, extremely weak.
Because it showed no appreciation, as you said, of the fact that he is part of the problem.
Yeah.
And he offering solutions.
I mean, when I sat down there listening to him, I can't tell you what I felt, you know. I can't say here.
But you could see from his expression, I heard some of that speech,
Yeah.
that these guys believe these things.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
amazing the self-deception they practice. These guys really believe what they say. They can't think past the evidence, the immediate evidence. Like some of the ministers, when I hear them, I mean, all of us make errors, I agree.
Yeah,
But I heard one of them being interviewed the other day in front of some foreigners. And every single noun that he used, he used the verb instead of noun. He said the person make a complaint, not a complaint. He used singular verbs, plural verbs with singular subjects. Throughout the presentation, the person asked me, "Is that your minister?" I was so embarrassed. I know this is one with a background of some so-called quote-unquote professional standing.
Okay.
This is shocking. So these guys, they feed off of each other in that level of, trashiness, and therefore can do no better.
Okay. As an aside, I noticed that the Marriott, I was passing through Kingston last evening, and the beacon on the,
Can't be seen now.
well, it may very well not be seen, so I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know what's going to happen.
That's a good plan.
Yeah, somebody
Yeah.
pointed that out to me, sent me the photograph
Yeah.
to show me that he took out how it's obscuring the lighthouse.
Well, you know,
It shows that the nature of the thinking, that's what I tell you about systematic
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah.
right.
It shows how you don't know what you have to do with a project. You have to bring in stakeholders, you have to ask all the questions, you have to look at all the physical and commercial other impact. What is going to happen to the other buildings around that area? Have they figured that into the cost of the Marriott? All the things that can't remain there, shacks and so on, because they're incompatible with the structure and the operations of the Marriott. The lighthouse, we're going to recite it.
Well, that's another thing.
Peasants.
And historical significance.
Yeah,
and
the
all.
historical, it's something that is priceless.
But you know, one of the things that really we will have to deal with is the continued misuse of funds, the NISIL issue, even the GGMC's funds being
Yeah.
transferred to NISIL.
Yeah, the
And
lotto fund
the
that
lotto
he's
funds.
got him in court for.
And then we see them
The still.
The
using
government
funds for this ICT project,
Mm.
you know, which they should not have because it didn't go through Parliament.
Right.
So they continued abuse.
But that's the point I should have made also,
Yeah.
about a lot of the off-budget expenditures in the budget. We know about the 208 billion, but what about the things that have been spent
Well, that's
outside the
another
budget
point.
and not accounted for?
So, despite, I mean, we're talking about cuts. then how effective will cuts be in the face of them having this lump sum, this avenue through which they can continue to channel funds
I
to the
think they
projects
feel
want.
that they have a right to a large state. And I think they feel that because that is progressive, that's socialist. And they feel that they don't recognize that they can't even manage properly a small state. And that by trying to manage a large state with all these things, they're creating some of the problems for themselves and making the development again more and more difficult.
So, Brother Trotman, how are you going to deal with? How are we going to rein
In the
in?
parliamentarian, I think that's a fair.
Well,
Please.
I'll be speaking tomorrow. And my focus will be, I think you have a sense of where my focus is going to be. I do believe that in a lot of these things, that in terms of the absence of any benefits, real benefits for working class people, that I owe it to them to stand up and make a call on their behalf. And I believe that the call that I will make is not only going to be limited to asking the government to provide money for them, because as Professor Thomas said, these wages and salaries increases must be seen as investments, and if it is the government is not prepared to make an investment, it is my duty to stand up in Parliament and call on people to act in their own interest, and I'm prepared to do that. I'm also concerned that about the state of corruption, how institutionalized it is in the society, and the fact, as I said, the government has no plan in dealing with it. And I am going to be making a call, among other things that I'm going to be speaking, I'm going to be making a call for the people to determine how it is this thing must evolve. Because for too long we have sat by and allowed the government to continue to go in their direction. I mean, when you sit down in Parliament listening to government's contribution to this debate, the arrogance which flows from them, is obscene. And we who are the majority in the House must make the government understand that they have gone as far as they are permitted to go. And we have a duty to the people who voted for us. And I believe it's important for that I, as a person who has been given a mandate by the majority of people in the society, to make a call, make a plea for them.
Okay, gentlemen.
I think that he should also emphasize that some of these calls that we make for inclusiveness, participation, and empowerment and so on, are universal calls. They now become standard United Nations practice.
Yeah.
And as a member of the United Nations family, we have a duty. You have a duty as a parliamentarian to see that this sort of practice is enforced in the practice, the laws, the regulations, and the practice of the Guyana government.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for being on the program. And as is normal, you would have brought out a number of points that should enlighten the public on these matters related to the budget, our finances, and people's condition in the country. And I do look forward to being with you again on this program next week, same time, on the same channel. So to you people out there, just keep your ears tuned, and if the action is necessary to ensure that you get what is due, then of course we'll be hoping that you will take the necessary action. Do have a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.